Picture this, July 1943, somewhere in the scorching hills of Sicily. Obergefreite Klaus Weber sits inside his Panzer IV, scanning the ridgeline through his vision slit. He's 23 years old, a veteran of France and Russia, and he's never been afraid of American infantry. Why would he be? His tank weighs 30 tons. Its frontal armor is 80 millimeters thick. The Americans have rifles, grenades, maybe a mortar if he's unlucky. Then he hears it, a sound he's never heard before. A whoosh, like air being sucked through a pipe. His commander screams something unintelligible. Weber's world explodes in white-hot fire as a shaped charge warhead punches through the side armor and detonates inside the crew compartment. 3 days later, Weber wakes up in a field hospital, half his body burned, his crew dead. He asks the medic what happened. The American weapon? What was it? The medic shrugs. The prisoners call it a bazooka, some kind of rocket tube. Every American infantryman seems to have one now. For the first time in the war, German tank crews, the masters of mechanized warfare, the Panzer elite who'd crushed Poland, France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union, were genuinely, viscerally afraid. Not of other tanks, not of artillery, of individual foot soldiers carrying tubes. This is the story of how that fear was born. How two American officers turned junk metal into a weapon that rewrote the rules of warfare, and how the most devastating anti-tank weapon of World War II was almost canceled before it ever saw combat. Here's what most people don't understand about 1942. America was terrified. Not the propaganda version where we're gearing up to save the world with confidence in apple pie. The real America, the one behind closed doors at the War Department, was watching German Panzers roll across newsreels and asking a question nobody could answer. How the hell do we stop those things? Because here's the brutal truth. We couldn't. American infantry in early 1942 had absolutely nothing that could reliably kill a German tank. British intelligence reports were flooding in from North Africa, showing Panzer IIIs and IVs shrugging off everything the Allies threw at them. Anti-tank rifles? Useless against modern armor. Artillery? Too slow, too vulnerable. Sticky bombs and magnetic mines? Sure, if you wanted your soldiers to run at a 50-ton vehicle firing machine guns. The casualty projections were nightmare fuel. And meanwhile, Hitler's Panzers were getting better. Thicker armor, bigger guns. The Tiger tank was already in development, a 60-ton monster that would make everything we had look like children's toys. The American military was about to send hundreds of thousands of young men into combat against an enemy they literally could not hurt. That's not strategy. That's slaughter. The answer had been sitting in a file cabinet since 1918. Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry, had actually solved this problem during World War I. He'd developed tube-launched rockets that could deliver explosive payloads with minimal recoil, portable, powerful, practical. He demonstrated prototypes to the Army in November 1918, showed them working systems, offered them the future. Then the armistice was signed. The war to end all wars was over. Why waste money on experimental weapons when peace had arrived? So Robert Goddard's research was filed away, stamped interesting but not necessary, and forgotten for 22 years while he went off to build rockets in the New Mexico desert and get mocked by the New York Times for suggesting spaceflight was possible. By 1940, with Poland crushed and France falling, some desperate clerk in the War Department remembered those old files. Suddenly, Goddard's crazy rocket ideas looked like prophecy. But there was a problem. Goddard's rockets needed warheads, something powerful enough to crack modern tank armor. In 1918, that technology didn't exist. In 1940, it barely existed, and nobody quite knew how to make it work. Enter the M10 grenade, a weapon that sounds boring but represented a breakthrough in physics. Shaped charges are weird. If you hollow out an explosive, the blast doesn't dissipate. It focuses into a jet of superheated plasma, moving at 25,000 feet per second. That jet doesn't bash through armor, it melts through it. 4 inches of hardened steel? Gone. vaporized. The M10 could theoretically stop any tank Germany had fielded. Theoretically. Because the M10 weighed 3.5 pounds. Olympic athletes might throw it 50 yards on a good day, but tank guns can kill you from a half-mile away. The math didn't work. You'd die before you got close enough to throw it. This is where Captain Leslie Skinner enters the story. And Skinner was the kind of officer who'd set a hospital roof on fire as a teenager while experimenting with homemade rockets. True story, 1915, his Army surgeon father was not amused. He'd been obsessed with rockets his entire life, and now, stationed at Indian Head Rocket Laboratory in Maryland, he was pulling Goddard's old research and thinking, what if we don't throw the grenade? What if we shoot it? Skinner sketched a tube-launched system. His superiors said no suitable warhead existed. Then the M10 arrived in early 1942, and Skinner immediately assigned the project to the smartest young officer he had, Lieutenant Edward Uhl, 24 years old, fresh from Lehigh University, Phi Beta Kappa honors, engineering degree, and zero combat experience. Uhl's job? Figure out how to make this work. Fast. Because American soldiers were about to land in North Africa, and they were going to face German tanks with, essentially, nothing. No pressure.
For weeks, Uhl failed. He tried different tube lengths, various propellants, multiple ignition systems. Every prototype had fatal flaws. Too much recoil, dangerous backblast, inaccurate, unstable, heavy, complicated. The clock was ticking, soldiers were training, and Uhl had nothing that worked. Then came the moment that changed everything. And it wasn't genius, it was luck. Uhl was walking past a scrap pile. Just walking, probably frustrated, definitely exhausted. He spotted a steel tube, about 5 feet long, roughly 60 millimeters in diameter. Something clicked in his brain, that engineering intuition you can't teach. He picked it up, held it against his shoulder like a rifle. The tube's diameter matched the M10 grenade almost exactly. The idea was so simple it was almost stupid. Put the rocket inside the tube. Let the tube guide it. Leave both ends open so the exhaust vents backward away from the shooter. Add a trigger. Done. No complicated mechanisms, no exotic materials, just hollow steel, wood, wire, and a battery. Uhl built a prototype in hours using scrap wood from rifle stocks and salvaged parts. Then he had to test it, which meant potentially blowing himself up if he'd miscalculated the backblast. He carried it down to the Potomac River alone, loaded a rocket, pointed it across the water, held his breath, squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket leapt out smoothly, no violent recoil, no blast of fire in his face, just a clean launch and a splash hundreds of feet away. Uhl stood there, probably shaking, realizing he just solved the unsolvable problem with garbage. When Uhl showed Skinner the prototype the next morning, Skinner immediately grasped its potential. They refined the design, better grip, proper trigger, electrical firing mechanism, and within weeks had a working weapon. Now they needed to convince the brass. A demonstration was scheduled at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942. The Army was testing various spigot mortars, expensive, crew-served weapons that also used shape charges. Skinner saw this as their shot to prove the launcher's worth. Morning of the demonstration, they realized their mistake. No sights. In desperation, Skinner grabbed a wire coat hanger and bent it into shape with a broken nail. That was it. That's what they were bringing to impress Army generals reviewing million-dollar weapons programs. A scrap metal tube with coat hanger sights. The spigot mortars went first, 5 models, professional crews, expensive equipment. They fired at a moving tank 300 yards away. Not one hit. 0. The generals looked disappointed, but unsurprised. Anti-tank weapons were notoriously inaccurate. Then Skinner hefted the launcher, tracked the tank, fired. Clang. Direct hit. The general stirred. He fired again. Another hit. And again. And again. With improvised coat-hanger sights, Skinner was hitting a moving target repeatedly while 5 sophisticated mortars had collectively failed. Brigadier General Gladian Barnes stepped forward. 30 decades of military service, countless weapons demos, and he'd never seen anything like this. He asked to try it himself. Barnes shouldered the tube, squinted through the wire sights, tracked the rumbling tank, and squeezed. Direct hit. He lowered the weapon, looked at it, looked at Skinner, and grinned. "It sure looks like Bob Burns' bazooka." Bob Burns was a popular comedian famous for his bizarre musical instrument, a long tube he called a bazooka. In that moment, with rocket smoke drifting across the range, Barnes christened a weapon that would terrorize tank crews on 3 continents. That afternoon, Barnes issued immediate orders: 5,000 launchers, not for testing, for combat. General George Marshall saw a demonstration days later and immediately ordered 5,000 launchers and 25,000 rockets. General Electric got the contract May 20, 1942, with an insane deadline: 30 days to deliver 5,000 bazookas. GE's engineers worked around the clock, reverse engineering Uhl's prototype. The design's simplicity saved them. No exotic materials, no precision machining required. Just steel tube, wooden stock, basic electrical components. They delivered with 89 minutes to spare. The weapon was officially designated Launcher Rocket 2.36-inch Anti-Tank M1. Nobody ever called it that. From factory floor to foxhole, it was simply the bazooka. But speed has consequences. The rush to production meant the M6 rockets weren't properly tested. Primers failed, propellant burned inconsistently, the electrical system proved fragile, and worse, far worse, American soldiers were receiving these weapons with zero training. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, America's first major offensive, Supreme Commander Eisenhower discovered the night before that his troops had never even seen bazookas. They were still in crates on transport ships. This was going to end badly. The bazooka's combat debut was a disaster. American soldiers in Tunisia, facing German armor for the first time, frantically unpacked bazookas they'd never trained with, loaded rockets they didn't understand, and fired at tanks that kept coming. Rockets misfired, fuses failed, electrical contacts corroded in the salt air. Soldiers who'd been told this weapon would save their lives watched rockets bounce harmlessly off enemy armor. After months of fighting, Army Ordnance compiled a devastating report. Not a single verified tank kill could be attributed to the bazooka. Not one. An American general visiting the front couldn't find a soldier who'd successfully stopped a German tank with the weapon. In May 1943, the Army suspended further deployment. The program seemed finished, millions of dollars spent on a weapon that didn't work when it mattered most. But Skinner and Uhl refused to give up. They completely redesigned the rocket. New contact system, improved propellant, better fuse. The launcher became simpler, lighter, more reliable. And critically, soldiers finally received proper training. By July 1943, when American paratroopers jumped into Sicily, they carried improved M1A1 bazookas and actually knew how to use them. The 82nd Airborne's drop went horribly wrong, scattered across 50 miles of countryside by high winds. By dawn, small groups of American paratroopers found themselves at Biazza Ridge, facing German Tiger tanks backed by infantry. Tigers. 60 tons of steel with frontal armor so thick it was essentially invulnerable. The first bazooka teams panicked, firing at Tigers head-on and watching rockets bounce off enemy armor. But seasoned NCOs remembered their training. Don't shoot the front. Target the sides, the rear, the tracks. Wait for the angle. As Tigers maneuvered, American teams repositioned. Through the long, brutal day, they found their shots. Side armor, engine compartments, vulnerable spots. When the battle ended, the German attack had stalled. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew. The bazooka, properly employed by trained soldiers, had proven itself. Finally, news spread fast. Soldiers who'd cursed the weapon after North Africa were requesting bazookas for their units. The weapon that had almost been canceled was becoming standard infantry equipment. German intelligence first learned about bazookas from captured American soldiers in Tunisia. They recovered examples from battlefields and from Soviet forces who'd received them through Lend-Lease. German ordnance engineers examined these specimens with professional interest. The shape-charge warhead was sophisticated, good design, solid physics, but the delivery system? Brilliant in its simplicity. An open tube. That was it. So elegant, so obvious in hindsight, and the Germans immediately understood, we need this. By late 1943, German troops were fielding the Panzerbuchse, rocket armor rifle, nicknamed Panzerstreck, tank terror. It was essentially a scaled-up bazooka with an 88mm warhead that could penetrate twice as much armor as the American version. The Germans had copied the design so precisely that American soldiers instantly recognized what it was. But the Panzerstreck had serious drawbacks. It weighed nearly twice as much, required protective equipment to fire safely, and produced a massive smoke cloud that revealed the shooter's position. The fact that Germany, the nation that invented modern armored warfare, felt compelled to copy an American infantry weapon spoke volumes. The psychological shift was profound. German tank crews who'd rolled across Europe with near impunity were suddenly vulnerable to individual foot soldiers. That was terrifying.
Now here's where the story gets genuinely weird. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carpenter was a history teacher from rural Illinois. Lost his family farm in the Depression, worked his way through college on scholarships, taught high school before the war. In 1944, he was assigned to Patton's Third Army as an artillery spotter, flying an L-4 Grasshopper, basically a militarized Piper Cub, fabric-covered, maximum speed 85 miles per hour, totally unarmed. Carpenter looked at his helpless little observation plane and thought, what if I mounted bazookas on it? Yes, really. He installed 6 M9 bazookas, 3 per wing, on plywood boards strapped to the wing struts, wired them to a control panel in the cockpit, nicknamed the plane Rosie the Rocketeer, and flew it into combat against German tanks. His attack profile was insane. Dive from altitude to about 100 meters above a tank, fire all 6 rockets at the vulnerable top armor, pull up hard, and pray you don't get shot down. Carpenter is officially credited with 6 tank kills, including 2 Tigers. Some witnesses claim 14. Either way, he was attacking 60-ton armored vehicles in an unarmed observation plane using shoulder-fired rockets. And it worked. After one mission, he told Stars and Stripes, "Word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs." The Germans had learned to fear a fabric-covered observation plane. Think about that. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. Americans stormed ashore carrying bazookas in the first waves, under withering fire, through obstacles and minefields and machine gun fire that turned the surf red. Bazookas proved crucial for reducing German strongpoints that had pinned down entire companies. The weapons weren't just anti-tank anymore. They were anti-fortification, anti-bunker, anti-anything that needed a big explosive hole in it. In the weeks after D-Day, fighting through Norman Bocage country, bazookas became essential survival tools. The dense hedgerows created a claustrophobic battlefield where combat happened at distances measured in yards. Perfect range for bazookas, too close for tanks to feel safe. But German armor kept improving. Panthers with sloped armor that deflected rockets, Tiger IIs that were essentially impervious from the front. American soldiers adapted. Teamwork became everything. Riflemen suppressed enemy infantry while bazooka teams maneuvered for side shots. General Patton wrote that bazooka should be used as a last resort at around 30 yards. Think about that number. 90 feet. A tank's machine guns can shred you from that distance in seconds. The mortality rate among bazooka operators was brutal. Yet volunteers never stopped coming forward.
Francis Currie earned the Medal of Honor at Malmedy, December 1944. German tanks overran American positions. Currie found a bazooka, but no ammunition. He ran across open ground, under heavy fire, to retrieve rockets from an abandoned half-track. Then he knocked out a German tank with a single shot. By what I would call a miracle, he said later, the rocket hit exactly where the turret joined the chassis. Currie survived, lived until 2019, carried that memory for 75 years. Albert Durago, 19 years old, had never fired a bazooka before volunteering to hunt German tanks near Stalmont, Belgium in December 1944. Years later, at age 89, he recalled, "I knew I was going to get it before I got down there, but God was with me." These weren't professional warriors. They were teenagers, teachers, factory workers, ordinary people who picked up a tube and walked toward machines designed to kill them. June 25, 1950. North Korean T-34-85 tanks rolled across the 38th parallel into South Korea. American forces, caught unprepared, had 2.36-inch bazookas, the same ones from World War II. Problem: T-34 frontal armor was too thick. The old bazookas were useless. July 5th, Task Force Smith, 406 American soldiers faced North Korean armor with 6 bazookas. They fired 22 rockets, 0 effect. Rockets bounced off harmlessly. The task force was routed. Colonel Robert Martin was killed July 8th attempting to stop a T-34 with a 2.36-inch bazooka. General MacArthur urgently requested the M20 Super Bazooka, the 3.5-inch version that had been developed too late for World War II. The first ones arrived July 20th at the Battle of Tejan. Results were immediate. 8 T-34s destroyed the first day. Time magazine reported it knocked out 7 tanks in 7 tries. Major General William Dean personally used an M20 against a T-34 from a second-story window at less than 10 yards range. Hit the turret ring, set it on fire, killed the crew. He later received the Medal of Honor, then was captured and held prisoner until 1953. The Super Bazooka saved American forces in Korea, but even as it did, the weapon's era was ending. 1985, a reunion in Germany for European campaign veterans. A moment that perfectly captures what the bazooka meant. A former German Panther commander approached an American veteran who'd carried a bazooka through France and Germany. Through a translator, the German said something remarkable. "We feared your tube rocket more than your tanks. Your Shermans we could destroy easily, but your rockets, they came from anywhere, from soldiers we could not see until too late. Many times we abandoned tanks that were not damaged just because we heard the sound of your rockets nearby." Why abandon operational tanks? The Germans smiled sadly. "Because we knew that the next rocket might come through our vision slot or strike our engine or catch us from behind. We were always looking over our shoulders. The fear was worse than the weapon." That was the bazooka's real victory. Not the technical specifications, not the kill counts, the fear. German tank crews, the Panzer elite who'd crushed Europe, were afraid of individual American infantrymen with tubes. The psychological revolution was complete. Leslie Skinner died in 1978, buried at Arlington. Edward Uhl lived until 2010, eventually becoming chairman of a Fortune 500 aerospace company. In his final years, he said, "We really had no anti-tank weapon. You can't believe how inept our military was at that point in time." From inept to unstoppable in 3 years. The bazooka was part of that transformation. The numbers tell part of the story. 476,623 bazookas manufactured, over 15 million rockets, thousands of enemy vehicles destroyed. But numbers miss the point. The bazooka did something more important than kill tanks. It changed what infantry meant in modern warfare. Before 1942, tanks were nearly invulnerable to foot soldiers. After 1942, tank crews could never ignore infantry again. Combined arms doctrine became essential. Tanks without infantry support were death traps. Every modern shoulder-fired rocket launcher, the AT-4, RPG-7, Javelin, hundreds of variants worldwide, traces its lineage to that crude tube Uhl spotted on a scrap pile. The bazooka wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. Early versions were borderline dangerous to the operator. But it worked well enough, fast enough, cheap enough to matter when it counted most important. And it gave soldiers something invaluable: hope. The knowledge that they weren't helpless against steel monsters. The certainty they could fight back. Obergefreitzer Klaus Weber, the German tank commander from our opening story, spent the rest of the war in hospitals and POW camps. In a 1970s interview, he was asked what weapon he feared most. Not artillery, not airstrikes, not other tanks. The American tube rocket, he said quietly, because you never saw it coming until it was too late. We went from hunters to hunted, and we never got used to that. That's the legacy. A scrap metal tube, wire coat hanger sights, and the weapon that made tanks afraid of infantry. Sometimes the simplest solution changes everything.